Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Quantum Resistant Ledger channel, the place where you come for the crypto and stay for the quantum. On today's episode, Michael Strike and I are joined by the team at Geometry Labs to have an AMA episode where we discuss the recent blog series that they put out this past few months on techniques for efficient post-quantum finance. We're joined today by Brandon Goodell and Mitchell Kravitz-Thayer from Geometry Labs to have an AMA, ask some questions big and small. Good to have you guys here with us.
Thanks.
Yeah, good to be here.
Yeah. Michael, good to see you as well. And looking forward to diving in. We've had a lot of community questions over, this got pushed back a few weeks. So we have a handful of questions from there, a couple others from our social channels. And while we're going through this AMA in a minute, we're going to dive into the AMA questions. But if you're at any time while we're going through this episode, if we're referencing any parts of the series, just look in the show notes. I'm going to have links to all of the blogs in the series, so you can quickly reference all of those. And guys, is it good on your side if myself and Michael, if we start going through the list of questions from the community?
Yeah,
great with me.
Off.
Cool. Well, we can start out kind of with at the top here. We had a question from one of our community members, Otslayer, which had to do with what was publicly available, which is private. I'll kind of shorten that one a little bit, just based on the work that you guys are doing, Geometry Labs. What's public? What's not public? What's the short answer there? We'll just start moving through some of these.
So the short answer is all of it is or will shortly be public. On the signature library and lattice algebra library, we have open source code bases on GitHub. We have the packages available through PyPy. The logic behind these is explained in the article series that you just referenced. Basically, we don't have any secret sauce, right? It's like everything we do for QL is open source. The piece we're working on right now, which is secure fountain architecture, will be getting flipped public very shortly. So yeah, everything we do is open and also licensed under the MIT license, which is the same one the QRL code base uses. Very permissive.
Yeah.
Sounds
good. This next question, I think it's kind of just we pass the mic around just to see if what everyone's take is on the next couple ones. But this one, it's from an unknown community member, and the question is, it's a good one. Every day that passes, it seems that there is a new attack on post-quantum lattices or a new paper that emerges showing weakness of them. That's definitely concerning in terms of post-quantum security. The question is, would you recommend a QRL, stay with HBS or layer 1 protocol and deploy post-quantum lattices as layer 2 parachain? Or would you rather recommend migrating from HBS to lattices, assuming the uncertainty risk paired with that? That's the question. So whoever wants to kind of take this one and we can kind of just keep running.
I'll start with this one, if that's okay, Mitchell. So the short answer is the best. There's not a short answer to this one. The best test of any cryptographic algorithm is time and security, or a test of its security is time, right? Letting it hang around for years and then see who can break it. So actually, every single time that a new attack on post-quantum lattices comes up and we see something like a moderate improvement in the exponential time of the algorithm or something like that, we're actually not too concerned. And the reason is because if it's still taking exponential time, then you can still easily just tweak the security parameter a little bit in order to make it secure for 128 bits of security or 256 bits of security or whatever. On the other hand, so people fall for this gambler's fallacy a lot, where they're like, oh, I've been seeing a lot of these papers breaking post-quantum lattices and stuff lately. That means it's going to be falling soon. That's not necessarily the case. There is a conjecturally sub-exponential algorithm that solves certain lattice problems that Dan Bernstein is working on right now, DJB. Daniel J. Bernstein. I know a little bit about it. It uses S-unit attacks, and beyond that, I actually haven't gotten very far into his work. But he is very careful to say every single time he's making these statements that it's sub-exponential, or it's conjecturally sub-exponential. We still don't have any evidence that any of the lattice assumptions upon which post-quantum cryptography is built are endangered. Having said that, keen-eyed readers will notice that only 2 types of algorithms made it through the NIST competition. There were lattice algorithms and hash-based security. And the question that Ryan just asked, he said HBS, that's hash-based security. So functions like the Sphinx function, the xmss security signature function, these are hash-based, right? Whereas Crystal's Dilithium and Crystal's Kyber are lattice-based. So the question is, are we really concerned, or should we migrate away from hash-based toward lattice-based? Well, unfortunately, only one hash-based algorithm made it through the NIST competition, and all the other algorithms were lattice-based. And only one encryption algorithm made it through the competition, and it's lattice-based. So if you're going to be doing a key encapsulation mechanism up to NIST standards in the future, you have to use Crystal's Kyber, period, which is lattice-based. That doesn't mean that QRL has to, right? They might use some other key exchange mechanism and then use hash-based protocols just like they're doing now, but that does mean it won't be up to NIST's standards, or rather in accordance with NIST standards, because up to implies that it'd be worse, right? It's not up to NIST standards, but that's not the case. The real issue is that QRL would be using hash-based stuff when most of the competition basically eliminated everything except for lattice-based stuff. I'm pretty sure that I did a pretty good job of answering that question. Would I recommend migrating away from hash-based towards lattice-based? I don't know about that. Personally, I really like hash-based protocols, but lattice-based protocols can be easy to work with. They can be easier to understand. You don't have to rely on this little black box hash function as much.
Yeah, thanks for covering that one. Mitchell or Strike, anything to add on that part, or we good to move on to the next question?
I have a thought, but I'll
good question.
First.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, I actually love that there's a new paper coming out every week breaking this stuff, right? Yeah. Like it's really wild
every week.
That we're in a situation where we're now building crypto systems against new and future adversaries. And then people are inventing new methods as new adversaries to break those. I mean, what a time to be alive. I mean, this is like the cutting edge. I just love it. That's more of like a philosophical statement, but I think it's really cool. Yeah. Mike, what are you going to say?
There's a part of me that believes in keeping things simple. But also there's a part of me that's a bit of a security purist at times, I think. And being that way, I can't help but think of what the advantages might be in order to do one at layer 1 and one at layer 2, sorry if that's confusing, in which a potential attack vector or bad actor would have to compromise both of them in order to compromise the chain as a whole.
So while that's it's an interesting idea. Generally, so this actually gets back to a question that's a little unrelated that somebody asked me the other day, and it might have been Mitchell. But let's say you have, I think you and I were talking about this, Mitchell. Mm-hmm. We're talking about encrypting something classically and then encrypting the ciphertext post-quantum.
It's the hedge
or vice versa. And generally, cryptographers really don't like doing that, because if you can break one, then you can break the other. So there's no reason to use the weaker one under any circumstances. But this isn't exactly the situation you described, because the hash-based protocols are unbroken and the lattice-based protocols are unbroken. But the way that you just described it, where you'd have to penetrate both layers in order to rewrite the ledger, that would be like a sort of a tricky thing to do, because in the end, all you really need to do to rewrite a ledger is surround somebody with your friends and then lie to them about what the ledger is. And that's true in Bitcoin, it's true in QRL, it's true pretty much across the board. Having said that, lattice-based crypto can be aggregated easily, it's smaller keys and so on and so forth. Actually, I shouldn't say smaller keys. But lattice-based crypto has some benefits. And if QRL built a layer 2 protocol, like a Lightning network, using the lattice-based protocol that settles with the XMS or some other hash-based signature system on the base layer, I can see a lot of benefits associated with that. So, yeah, I mean, like, this is the thing about blockchain design is for every person on the planet who has an opinion, there's a different way to design a blockchain.
That actually gets me thinking that it would be challenging to use this like layer 1, layer 2 with different schemes to protect like the whole thing. But I could imagine a version where if there's some kind of experimental thing that is like, we're pretty sure it's safe, but there's like a missing security proof on the hardness assumption or something. I wonder if there would be a version where it could be out on a sidechain for damage control, so that if there does turn out to be a flaw in that you've kind of like quarantined it so that everything on the base layer is still moving. I don't know. It's kind of a weird thought. Probably wouldn't roll anything out that experimental.
Right. Unfortunately,
maybe for testing though, potentially.
Unfortunately, composability, taking two cryptographic things and just composing them and gluing them together, oftentimes doesn't give you the security of either of the underlying things. So you can be like, oh, I have this great new encryption scheme. First, I'll do RSA, and then I'll do a group signature, and then I'll do with discrete logarithms, and then I'll do a lattice-based signature on top of that, and blah, and then nobody will be able to break it. It turns out that because of the way that you glued things together, you just basically glued like 3 bicycles together, but you glued them by the axle and the wheels. So like the wheels aren't going to rotate. So long story short, cryptographic engineering, oftentimes we come up with these ideas, and then after thinking about them, they just fall apart. So I actually can't answer the question in further detail than that, but I can say that having 2 different layers with 2 different hardness assumptions underlying them may have some benefits, but it may also have some drawbacks. Other than that, that's basically the best I can do.
I like that answer, and I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's go into a couple more. Some of these might be quicker, then we might have a couple ones that get drawn out a little bit longer depending on the question. But this next one is from Tim G, community member. He's got 2 questions, so I'll ask both his back to back. First one is on staking. What are the implications of having smaller staking amounts versus larger ones? Some of the community lean towards smaller staking, but I would like to see unpalatable effects down the road. Please expand on the subject if you guys have time to do so. So we'll cover that one first if you guys would like. Whoever wants to take this one.
I have some thoughts on that, and these are my own personal opinions. I would lean towards smaller amounts. The motivation being, one, just making it as egalitarian as possible. I mean, there's always going to be some floor because you have to run a node and either buy the hardware or rent the cloud or whatever. There's going to be some floor cost. But by and large, I think the more people running validators, theoretically, the better. One benefit of having small amounts that are accessible to a larger group is, let's say you do have some of these people, there's always going to be some fund or whatever that's just has like, millions of dollars, right? And is going to, without other incentivization, would just run one node, right? And then this is where people start to get the, hey, rich getting richer criticism and all of that. When there's smaller node amounts, especially if there's some incentivization, like your payouts being quadratic with respect to your stake, then what you're doing is, sure, this person could plunk 10 million in a node, but then they're incentivized to actually spread it across a variety of nodes. And so we're incentivizing them to make the network infrastructure more secure. So I like small stake for accessibility, for encouraging a more robust infrastructure, and just decentralization in general.
My thoughts on this are a little bit more complicated. And part of this is that I don't necessarily know as much about stake as Mitchell. So actually, I would very much like to encourage the listener to listen to Mitchell, not me. However, there's a cost and a drawback to having the small amounts. Moreover, one of the benefits that Mitchell just described is actually a fake benefit. So let's tackle these 2 things one at a time. First off, the cost of having small amounts. If every single time you want to stake something, you need to broadcast a transaction, and you have 1 million coins or whatever, and you can only stake one at a time, then that means you need to broadcast 1 million transactions that need to be recorded to the ledger in order to get your 1 million nodes fired up. Which is true if you have 1 million nodes. Period. Is that 1 million transactions are going to have to end up on the blockchain eventually in order to get those nodes fired up. But the amount of weight on the blockchain in terms of kilobytes is therefore significantly greater because each transaction has a minimum size, right? And so if I could do all of them at once, then I only need to make one transaction. That puts the weight on miners and other stakers. It reduces the weight on other stakers. However, that may or may not be a big deal, number one, because everybody knows space isn't that big of a deal. The real issue is communicating that information to new nodes, right, so that they can bootstrap. So it's not so much that I have to pay for having storage costs, but it takes longer for new nodes to bootstrap that way. But also the benefit of having 1 million nodes actually sounds great. And in fact, it actually is topologically good for a lot of reasons. That surrounding problem that I mentioned earlier starts to go away if you have people doing this. However, it doesn't change the fact that 50% of the network has to be assumed to be dishonest, or 33%, or whatever the staking protocol is allowing. And so
correct.
As a consequence,
I was just advocating for the network robustness. It doesn't change centralization in terms of entity ownership. Absolutely.
Bingo. Great minds think alike. That was exactly what I was going to say. Yep. Right. You still have one party controlling those nodes. So if they're dishonest, you haven't really gained any security. But what you have gained is a graceful degradation of the network. Right. So if nodes start to drop off, the network still has no problem. But if you only have a few nodes, one node drops off, it's possible the whole network gets split into two.
I think, by the way, I love what you were, I think, implicitly pitching, which was in a situation where high node counts are encouraged by one way or another, that it would be useful for the protocol to include a transaction that can batch load nodes instead of doing like one per each. I don't know if you were pitching that or not, but it was what came to mind.
I wasn't pitching it specifically, but that's actually one of the reasons aggregatable signatures attracted me in the first place. Right. This way, if every single block has a single aggregate signature that's describing all of the new proof of stake nodes, then every block has that minimum size of the aggregated signature, and you can be adding 1,000 nodes per block. It's great. Nice. So yeah,
brings it full circle.
Yeah, that brings us back to one of our previous chats with Ryan and Michael about aggregatable one-time signatures. Oh, there was another thing that came up about the stake thing, is that if you're using a protocol that uses one-time signatures, then you have to have a signature for each key that you want staking. Whereas if you have a many-use signature scheme, many-time signature scheme, you can reuse the key multiple times. And so you don't have to keep posting keys on the blockchain, right? So this is one of the negative traits of one-time signatures, is that you're going to end up with more keys posted to the blockchain, whereas with many-time signatures, you have fewer. And that's one of the issues that is relevant.
Which may or may not be an issue if you're in a situation where for the one time you can fit the signature and the verification key in the same space as just the signature for reusable.
Yes.
That's a weird nuance, but
these are all these details, right?
Yeah.
Inside baseball.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll quit. Yeah. Strike. Anything else on the staking to add to that?
Yes, I'm listening.
I figured you had a few.
We've talked about consensus before. So I think I did give this some thought, and I believe in as many validators as, I guess, more validators, even if smaller ones, are more beneficial to the security of the network, because they're less like there's with a bunch of smaller validators, even though they're weighted as smaller, I would say that the possibility of collusion on the network in order to garner consensus decreases quite a bit. So even if you had like 20% of smaller balances, I think that helps secure consensus. But with that being said, I also like the idea of existential deposit, in that in order to maintain the account, You have to have certain amount of coin in your account, which can't elapse, I don't know, let's say call X 30 days.
It's like a balance.
So after 30 days, if you've got less than one quanta or one, or one whatever, so whatever arbitrary amount that people, the democratic governance agrees to, then that reduces some of the overhead of the ultrafine sand, I suppose, that needs to maintain in the state files, and that could potentially clog up the network.
That could be a middle ground, yeah.
As like a middle ground. So I didn't intentionally pick middle ground between kind of Mitchell, what you're describing, and Brandon. In full, to be honest, this was kind of my answer as soon as Ryan had asked the question, but chronologically, there's no way to go back in time. So I guess we'll really never know.
Makes sense to me. Yeah.
Well, the
Brandon, I saw you shaking your head though on something I said though. So
it's a small bit actually.
Okay, please.
The idea that you're reducing the probability of collusion is assuming that each node doesn't know each other, and they don't talk at the coffee shop down the street, and they don't know that they're all operated by the same malicious entity, right? So in cryptography, oftentimes when we think about security for things like consensus mechanisms, we don't assume a multitude of adversaries, which is what kind of like how we imagine the Bitcoin network is like, oh, there's this dude in the basement over here who wants my money, and there's these dudes in Iran who want my money, and so on and so forth. By the way, nothing wrong with basements or Iran for that matter. The idea that, like, if I'm a single entity, like I'm Jeff Bezos, and I've just decided to own some proof of stake blockchain, I might end up firing up 10,000 nodes specifically to try to convince people that a lot of people have joined the network and that they're all honest, right? But in the back end, I'm actually running that from a common database, and I know which nodes are mine. So this is why I say the topological properties of the network are graceful, right? Because you're adding more nodes and legs to the network, and so if you pluck any one of them out, the whole network won't get split into two, and you're less likely to be surrounded entirely by malicious nodes if you're an honest node. But you can't say much about the consensus mechanism, unfortunately. That's actually one of the big drawbacks of proof of stake.
So I did reference collusion in there, not because I think it is more difficult for collusion to happen when there's multiple smaller wallets. But as far as in your scenario, you're not talking about collusion. You're talking about
one bad guy.
Essentially, a Sybil attack is one person
becoming
many different identities on the network, right? Which comes back to 51%. So, yes, I would have to give some thought to exactly the differences between the collusion and the Sybil part. That the pros and the commonalities, but
the main thing is the worst case scenario is what cryptographers try to protect against, and the worst case scenario is that all the malicious nodes are operated by one person. Right. And so that's pretty much the cryptography philosophy behind, I shouldn't put quotes around that. That's the philosophy behind cryptography security schemes, is to just assume the worst case of an adversary who has turned the entire universe into a computer. Right. We don't need even 80 or 100 bits of security. We don't need 100 bits. We might need 80 bits of security eventually, but like, already cryptographers go for 256 bits so that there's no hope that somebody could come along and turn the whole universe into a computer and break your scheme. And like, honestly, yes, I that's a fantasy world, right? But like when we're running a financial network, where's the cutoff between a couple of colluding bad guys and this omnipotent invisible force? It's a smooth ramping thing, and it's just easier to, I should say it's actually harder to just assume that they're all one bad guy, right? Yeah. So, anyway.
But at the end of the day, if there's consensus, I mean, code is law. So, depending on the consensus mechanism, can you call that? I use the word, but I even sometimes have difficulty saying the word bad actor because the rules are already set. Now, if I'm counting cards at a table, then I'm just advantaged play. But that's going to take us down a different road.
I'm reminded of an old math joke, which actually gets us to another question that we have later, but I'm going to tell it now, and then I'll tell a different joke later. A Russian topologist told me this joke. Okay, just forget the background. English is a second language. And he says, one time his friends, oh gosh, it had to do with like the inside of a circle versus the outside of a circle, and somebody was in a jail cell, right? And this guy's like, I'm on the outside of the jail cell, you're on the inside. And if 51% of the parties on the network are malicious, doesn't that make them the honest ones and everybody else malicious?
I'm not sure that's a joke.
It just makes me think.
I'm not saying it's not funny. That's because I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I forgot the punchline and the setup and everything.
I mean,
well, the consensus is greater than that. I wouldn't say that's who's right or wrong. That the 51% or more becomes truth.
Yes.
Then that becomes truth.
Yes.
Not right or wrong. My point earlier was an ideological one in that there isn't necessarily right or wrong. There's just rules and actions and what consensus means to be truth and untrue. And Mitchell, you got cut off a couple of times. Apologies, please.
So I guess I'll work backwards. In terms of like the code is law, there's no bad actors. I think that we can look at it through that framework and then say like, okay, well, anything that passes consensus laws is allowed and is behavior. And we can just kind of group it into like benign or constructive, which are people that are just extending the longest chain and moving things forward and not censoring transactions, or like a malicious question mark, depending on your perspective, if they're censoring transactions. Yeah, that's all. Hey, I'm just going to actually not even touch that. I do think the big picture for a lot of the consensus stuff is like, by and large, if there are stake-weighted decisions being made, whether that stake is divided into many nodes for robustness or one node for convenience, doesn't change. It's still the same actor. It's still the same malicious capital. You can almost think of it rather, instead of malicious people, think of it as malicious capital, regardless of how that's split up. I do think this is a place where proof of stake actually has a nice benefit over proof of work. And this is strictly a practical thing. And that is that the majority of your proof of work miners are joining pools, right? And the pools always just seem to hover around like 45, 50%, right? And very few people are checking the blobs coming in from their pools to see if their pool is censoring anything. And so you could be very easily complicit in malicious mining. And in fact, I don't want to name and shame anyone in particular, but I found public pools that were doing like data encoding in fields that they shouldn't have. And this is just people mining these blocks for years, having no idea that their pool is sending them really weird blobs. With proof of stake, I think it's more likely that you're going to, and by the way, asterisk, there's cool solutions like this, like P2Pool, lots of awesome work happening there. But I think by and large in proof of stake, if you're doing your own transaction selection and processing, then if I do just decide to spin something up, it's less likely that I'm not going to join a pool and accidentally contribute to something that I don't want to. Anyways, that's the end of the ramble.
That's a good point. You submit to a pool and then, sorry, Brandon. When you submit to a pool, that's just the pool and the block the problem that's solved in the subsequent reward. That's essentially an uncollateralized loan within the pool, right?
Wait, say that again.
Okay, so you have a mining pool. Let's just call it proof of work for now.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You're mining. You have all this processing power going to a central entity, and the work that's being done is essentially an uncollateralized loan of your processing power to the mining pool. There's no guarantee that you're going to pay your block, and there's no guarantee that the blocks that are being found are being reported honestly in the first place. How would you know? It's distributed. All the computing is distributed. So, and then on top of that, without going too much down a rabbit hole, the other ideological question that comes out of what you were talking about, Mitchell, I think, is if code is law, what becomes the difference between a bad actor, per se, and just someone executing game theory? So those are my thoughts.
There's also one, yet another angle to the proof of stake question that that none of us have addressed yet that just occurred to me. This goes back to the layer 1, layer 2 stuff that you mentioned earlier, Michael. It occurred to me just now. Every extra layer that you add is more code that every node needs to know forever in order to verify that blockchain. So if you add extra parts of a protocol, you are adding to the code base that the node needs to run forever. You can't get rid
Scalability,
of parts of it. Yeah.
operational complexity. Correct. Yes, all of these things increases. You might not be able to move. For example, if you added that extra layer of complexity because you want to be ultra secure, the irony is that you might not be able. That extra code. That extra code does not allow you to go post-quantum secure for some unimagined reason or whatever, assuming that they would have been able to, and then there's a small minority of actually being able to pull off this hat trick, right? So,
yeah.
I agree.
I think I have an unsatisfying answer to your like what under code is law, like what's malicious or not. And this is like, I'm just going to like arbitrarily draw a line and say like rolling back blocks, I'll consider malicious, even if there's an economic incentive. Censoring transactions, I'll consider malicious, even if there's an economic or regulatory incentive. Beyond that, I think everything's kind of gray area, like minor extracted value on Ethereum, kind of gray area. There's ways to do it that don't hurt the people you're extracting value from, like back running. There's ways to do it that do hurt the people that would be extracting from, like front running. That's where it gets, like, to me, morally gray. And I could start telling you where I draw the lines, but then it's just getting into like now we've moved away from code as law to like opinions on types of activity.
If you don't want to roll back the chain, then don't upgrade your node.
Yeah, I'm going to go into the next. I'm going to take us into the next.
Ryan,
next question here.
Put us back on track.
If you don't want to roll back your chain, don't run a node at all.
Yeah. And then this next one is the second one from Tim G. We covered the first one for quite a while, and this one is in layman terms. What efficiencies do stateless encryption schemes have over stateful schemes like xmss?
I actually have a real short answer to this question, and it's perhaps oversimplified. But in a stateful encryption, or by the way, first off, Tim G means signature schemes, because xmss is a signature scheme, Sphinx is a signature scheme, and so on. So what's the difference between stateless versus stateful signatures? And the answer is that for a stateful signature scheme, you need to remember which signatures your key already signed. So you need to store every message and signature that you've produced so far from that key and remember them forever, which is a drag. Like, even if it's not that big of a deal in terms of space or whatever, it's a drag. It makes each individual wallet have a linearly increasing storage requirement. Compare that to like Bitcoin, for example, right? Your wallet doesn't get bigger when you've spent more money.
I think that... Yeah, I'll use strike.
I can add on to that if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
The other thing is for the signing algorithms for the public-private key pairs, you have to front load the processing.
Yeah.
For hash-based, right?
Yeah.
Hans Olo had a question on, will Isogenies be explored by Geometry Labs on behalf of QRL? I know we already chatted on this, that you guys had no plans currently, but of course, obviously, if QRL wanted to move forward in that in any capacity, could look into that. But I'll jump into the next question here. We got a good one on Python Falcon here. This is an unknown question, and it is your Python library using Falcon or Dilithium Kyber lattice work? And which one of these is your favorite for blockchain application, and why? Whoever wants to take and run with this one.
So the Python library lattice algebra that we're using is capable of supporting most of the stuff that you need in order to implement either Falcon signatures or Dilithium signatures or Kyber encryption. It's missing some sampling algorithms and things like that, basically random number generators that are specific to those algorithms that weren't included in our nice general Python library. Which lattice work we're using, it turns out that all three of those signature schemes use a very, very, very similar ring. And the main and by ring, I mean like the environment, the lattice that you're working in. The main differences have to do with technical things like sampling, how Falcon uses a trapdoor to generate signatures. So you need to like sample that trapdoor, things like that. So the short answer is our library is one level lower on the infrastructure level than either Falcon or the crystals schemes. We are an infrastructure that you could use to implement those things. The next part of the question is, which is my favorite? I think Falcon is cool, personally. Kyber is the only key encapsulation mechanism that survived the competition. And you can build using a key encapsulation mechanism and a signature scheme, using just those two things. You can build a claim or refund model of a cryptocurrency that is capable of rather rich scripting and stuff, which is really cool. So if I was going to do a post-quantum encryption or a post-quantum cryptocurrency starting today from scratch, I would use Kyber as the key encapsulation mechanism to generate keys on the fly. And I would use probably Falcon or these aggregatable one-time signatures that we've developed as the signatures. The problem with Falcon, again, similar to crystals, dilithium, it's not necessarily aggregatable easily. So as far as efficiency goes, I'm not actually a fan of either of them, but comparing either of them to an aggregatable one-time signature scheme isn't fair, because both Falcon and dilithium are many-time signature schemes. And the aggregatable scheme that we've been working on is a one-time signature scheme. And so every single time you use the aggregatable guy, you have to publish a key and a signature, whereas every time you publish a Falcon signature, you just need to publish a reference to the key and a signature. And usually that reference to the key is already built into the transaction somehow. So I like Falcon more than dilithium. I understand dilithium more than Falcon.
I will cover the next one. This one's kind of a for you guys a question either or. Post-quantum supersingular Isogenies, I always butcher that, versus homomorphic encryption fight. This is on you guys. Any takes here? This one I didn't. Yeah.
All right, so
there you go. You got it way better than me.
Supersingular Isogenies. So actually an isogeny is easy to understand. Supersingular ones maybe not so much. But an isogeny, you take a nice smooth map through a nice smooth space, or a path, not a map, path, and you send it to another nice smooth path in space. And the map carrying each point to each point is the isogeny. Gotcha. That's what an isogeny is. That's it. Super easy. Unfortunately, supersingular ones have basically divide by zero errors in the function that describes that map. Okay, so something like 1 divided by x cubed at 0 goes nuts, right? It's a bad function to use, except somehow mathematicians and cryptographers have figured out how to use these supersingular isogenies as hardness assumptions underlying crypto schemes. So supersingular isogenies are more like discrete logarithm-based groups. Okay, they are they're related to a hardness assumption from which you build cryptography schemes. Homomorphic encryption is one such cryptography scheme. And in fact, we can build homomorphic encryption functions out of supersingular isogenies or lattices or discrete logarithm-based group functions, stuff like that. In fact, the reason that range proofs work in Monero. Actually, I'm not even going to mention Monero. If you look at Mibblewimble, that's an even simpler example of this. Basically, they exploit homomorphic encryption to show that you encrypted something to a version of 0, right? And that you're showing them an encryption of 0. And the way that you do that is you do math on the ciphertexts. And that's what homomorphic encryption is. The homomorphic part just means that it respects addition and multiplication. So ax plus b, you push that through a function, you get f of a times f of x plus f of b. That's all homomorphisms are. So what that means is that you're allowed to do math on the ciphertexts, and it will match the math on the underlying plain texts. And so instead of having to reveal the plain texts to figure out if somebody's doing some math correctly, you can actually just do it on the ciphertext and never actually learn what was encrypted in the first place. So the question itself actually reveals a little bit of a misunderstanding. Supersingular isogenies are hardness assumptions from which we build crypto protocols, and homomorphic encryption is a crypto protocol. So how would I have them fight in the same way that I would have
We should just close
fight
that
a baby?
answer. We should close that answer with that analogy.
I would.
Yeah. So Mitchell, I think you might have in our last episode touched on benchmarking. Maybe it was you, Brandon, but I'm just going to read their question. Have you done any benchmark? If so, do we need a good CPU to run this library? I didn't expand on it too much more than that within the question, but any of you guys want to make mention here? Yeah.
So not only did we do benchmarks, the code to run the benchmarking is included in the open source repositories.
Yep.
So if you go to Lattice Crypto, the top folder is benchmarks. You can pop it open, run it yourself. The main thing that matters is generally verification time, right? Because that's the thing you want to do a million of in a row when you're syncing up a node. On my computer, it was like 60 milliseconds per signature that I was verifying. This was batched on like a research workstation, so it would be a little bit slower. But you don't need a supercomputer or anything to run these. And in fact, it would be really great to kind of get some benchmarks from people running on various hardware.
Yeah, especially because if you look at like something like discrete logarithm based stuff, we're talking about what 10 milliseconds, or am I? Yeah, so like if we're down at like 60 or something for post quantum, like that's pretty comparable. It's pretty good.
Yeah, with some batching, but we're definitely down on like a reasonable scale. And especially, by the way, our code, because we wanted it to be super clean, super interpretable, reference code that doesn't involve knowledge of NumPy and all these different sublibraries, we use the built-in Python types. So if you're porting this over to C or Go, it's going to be faster. If you start using just-in-time compiling or C-based functions in Python even, it could be faster. So these are even just the benchmarks for the implementation that's meant to be readable primarily.
So I'm a user, and I don't want to or necessarily know how to go through the code in order to do this. What about a simple answer, guys, for the rest? For someone that might not be as well versed in benchmarking software. Top 3 things in order: network, CPU, RAM. Well, hard drive is going to be pretty much. It's just going to be able to have to hold the chain, right? But what order? What are I took a guess. Network, CPU, RAM. That's my guess. I don't know.
Network would be kind of a non-issue, or it's just proportional to your signature size. But in terms of carrying out these operations, CPU or RAM, Brandon, do you?
I don't know how to compare those two things with each other, right? Because RAM is a space-related
now that you had the context
thing,
on it, like if
CPU
you're
if I had a
thinking about it
budget
from the
right.
user that's like, hey, I got a few
Sorry,
$100 bucks.
I've got a $500 budget. Sorry for not being clear. Okay. Right.
A typical hard drive on pretty much any computer, even now, is going to be able to handle handling signatures and keys, no problem. We're talking about maybe like 15 kilobytes maximum for a signature and a key.
Right.
So that's not that big of a deal.
Correct.
If I was on a budget, look, I'll be perfectly honest. I can sign and verify things on a crappy Chromebook quickly. I think that people worried about low budget devices being able to verify these signatures are, unless you have some very, very specific use cases, in which case the questions are very, very detailed. The general answer is you don't have to worry about it. This is going to should be no worse than discrete logarithm stuff, maybe times 100. At worst case scenario, maybe times 10. So CPUs nowadays, any CPU on the market will be able to do it, no problem. And we'll be able to do it quickly, no problem. Space might be the bigger constraint because the keys are bigger than discrete logarithm.
So the good answer. So any modern computer, I think that's why I picked network first, in order to be able to download transactions faster, because the CPU is just going to be able to crank through them with any modern computer. So I think the answer for the community, any modern computer will be able to function in this way. So
yeah, and if we ever do a cryptocurrency based implementation of using these signatures, then all of the reason that we were interested in these signatures in the first place is because it puts all the burden on the network. It puts the burden on transferring information to nodes. It doesn't put the burden on verifying it or storing it. So as a consequence, I think network is probably going to be the biggest cost in terms of being able to support these things.
And with network, I think low latency, not necessarily high bandwidth. But I mean, that's probably a different conversation.
Well, so this actually gets us away from the cryptography stuff and towards secure fountain architecture stuff, which is a more network-based question. And for the secure fountain architecture stuff, what you're doing is you're exchanging local storage space for higher bandwidth. Latency doesn't even come into the question. So, but that's for the next piece of software that we haven't even started talking about yet, which is secure fountain architecture. So the idea is basically specifically if storage space is going to become a long-term problem, which with blockchain bloat we all know is, then it would be better to reduce that local storage space in exchange for high bandwidth, because everybody's going to be having faster and faster network speeds for a long, long time. But in terms of the blockchain growing, like we can pretty carefully track that, and we know how bad that's going to get. We don't know how fast internet's going to get, right? Well, actually, we do know it's not going to get faster than the speed of light. I don't know what's the mass of a bit. Actually, this is an answerable question. I once measured the length of a bit. If you look at the
it depends on how fast it's modulated. Right. It has to be it has to be a construct of the Planck length.
Right. It has to be like measured in some multiple of the Planck length. But
it's you look high.
At how much energy is necessary to flip a bit if the bit is made of material that is like on the Planck scale.
It depends on frequency.
Like a bit is like this long.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
But that depends on, it's free. Yeah. Oh, yeah. That could be meters.
The last one we're going to cover, I'm going to read it out, and then whoever wants to take this one. This is from community member John Teeter. Recently, a report from Center of Encryption and Information Security, MATZOV in Israel, presents on several algorithmic improvements to the dual lattice attack, which allow it to exceed the efficiency of primal attacks. In the improved attack, they enumerate over more coordinates of the secret and use an improved distinguisher based on FFT. Combining these improvements considerably reduces the security levels of Kyber, Saber, Dilithium, and LWE, LWR based finalists, bringing them below the thresholds. And recently announced lattice algebra blog between QRL Geometry Labs. One of the potential applications of the module is noted as being a Python implementation of NIST, competitor crystals, dilithium signature scheme. Finally, to their question, which is what security impact, if any, would this recent report have on the aforementioned dilithium Python implementation? I know we talked about earlier in this AMA that stuff's coming out every week, kind of answered that part already. But this question is a good one. So whoever wants to take this one, and then we'll wrap up our AMA for today.
So the short answer is the dilithium standard has now basically been set. So if I was going to be implementing the dilithium into Python using our lattice algebra library, I would be following the specifications in dilithium, period. Because that's the standard. That's the point. The more practical question is, what security impact would this have on the implementation? So I wouldn't change what I was implementing if I was going to do dilithium, but the result of MATZOV's recent discoveries, or rather recent work, would mainly lead to larger dilithium parameters if we were going to change the standard to take the new attacks into account, which we should do. The standards should still be malleable for another 2 years or 3 years until more study has been done. I personally don't think the standards process should be really completed yet. Having said that, the work at MATZOV, as far as I know, hasn't really improved. Going back to the very, very first question we talked about today, it hasn't really broken through that exponential barrier that I was describing. It has made things faster, but it's still exponential. Moreover, it's only certain attacks against lattice crypto that they've improved. And if you look in the literature, the most efficient attack, quantum sieving, is not involved in this. So right now, what we've been doing for our parameter selection is we've been assuming the worst possible attack, which is quantum sieving, and we've been basing our parameter selections based on that. This work that Teeter is asking about, or Titer is asking about, which, by the way, great name, John. This work here is about improving classical and some quantum attacks against lattices, but not the best known attack against lattices, as far as I know. Granted, I'm not perfect. I've read a lot of literature. I may have misunderstood things. So for my algorithms that I've been setting parameters for, this would have no impact on my parameters. If I was going to be reparameterizing dilithium in order to take these attacks into account, that might lead to slightly larger key sizes and signature sizes. But other than that, it won't have too much of a practical impact, specifically because they're studying the not so good attacks against lattices. On the other hand, that work that I mentioned by Bernstein earlier, that he conjectures might be made sub-exponential using S-unit attacks, that one may have more of an impact on things. And we have to keep a very close eye on that as they make their developments, because it's possible, exclamation point, big caveat here, it is possible that algorithm would be capable of breaking lattices in sub-exponential time. Having said that, even if it did, that doesn't necessarily mean it can do it fast enough in our lifetime for us to really be worried about it.
You mentioned if anyone had any good math jokes or anything like that. We had someone in the community asked, let us know what's your favorite veggie. Anything there, guys? I'm going to remain silent on this one, but I don't have anything. I don't have anything further other than my cheesy comment. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I have an answer. I take offense to the assumption of the question that veggies are liked in the first place. Not personal, not saying that I don't, but I don't. But the question implies that someone does already, and that's a little bit presumptuous.
Yeah. My favorite vegetable, actually all my favorite vegetables I can't really eat a lot of because I'm on blood thinners. So things like Brussels sprouts and kale and broccoli, I love those things, but I can't eat them, in quantity anyway. But I actually, it really depends on how much I've been hanging out with Zuko lately. Because Zuko's a carnivore. Zuko, by the way, for the viewers, he's the CEO of Zcash. Anyway, what about you, Mitchell? What's your favorite vegetable?
And your favorite mathematical constant, Brandon?
My favorite mathematical constant is
Mitchell, all you, then we'll loop back.
Because it doesn't exist.
Oh, here we go. Right.
Oh, let's see. I feel like I should favor lettuce-based cryptography. Actually, there's always like a sweet spot in my heart for Brassica rapa, because back in grad school, some of my friends and I, we took a bunch of samples, did gene sequencing, did dimensionality reduction to turn it into like numeric parameter or numeric representation, and then when you start plotting them, if we plot like the first two principal components, you could see whether it was an oil seed or a cabbage or a mustard weed. And then if you split on PCA3, you could actually tell geographically whether it was like which kind of hemisphere it was from. And then if you split on the fourth principal component, you could actually even tell whether it was like weedy or cultivated. So I know that's a super nerdy answer, but Brassica rapa is just really cool from like a genetic lineage perspective.
So this is what happens when nerds go unmoderated. But Ryan, you actually do have the timestamps in the QRL video, so people can skip ahead and skip back. For my answer on favorite mathematical constant, I'm going to give an answer with a twist. I'm going to have to go with the speed of light, 300 kilometers per second, or 186,281 miles per second. But my answer is actually BS. Not on my preference, but that's not the best answer, because the speed of light isn't based on the speed of light. The speed of light is based on causality.
Speed of causality.
So for everyone that accepted my answer at face value, that's not actually the best answer. A better answer would be causality, because cause and effect. The speed of light is simply an effect of an effect on the speed of cause and effect.
I feel like there has to be some mathematical paradox in explaining why you selected causality.
We're going to be having an upcoming Reddit AMA following this. So if you're watching this, we might have already had the AMA by then, but If you haven't had another question, let us know in the comments of our video. Other than that, I appreciate myself and Michael, appreciate Brandon and Mitchell, you guys coming on. It's always good conversation. And as Michael said, there's going to be notes in the show notes
so
for
much, guys.
Links to all the parts in the series, as well as any other mentions. I know Mitchell, you also mentioned an upcoming paper on the blog that's going to be coming out. So other than that, appreciate you guys coming on. Enjoy the conversation. Hope the community did as well, and we look forward to chatting next time, guys.